That dog has been here longer than some of our employees." The shelter manager said it with a tired smile, but nobody laughed. Caleb Turner glanced through the chain-link kennels as he carried his toolbox down the concrete hallway. The county animal shelter sat on the edge of a small Colorado town, squeezed between a recycling center and a storage yard. The building was clean but crowded. Barking echoed off the walls. Volunteers moved from kennel to kennel. Families stopped to meet younger dogs. Children pointed excitedly at puppies. Adoption papers changed hands. Life moved forward, except in the last kennel. Caleb had come to repair a faulty heating unit. That was all. He had no plans to stay, no plans to look around, no plans to leave with anything except a completed work order. Then he noticed the German Shepherd. The dog lay quietly on a folded blanket in the corner of the final kennel. He did not bark when people walked past. He did not jump against the gate. He did not compete for attention like the others. His deep sable coat had begun turning gray around the muzzle. One ear carried a small notch. His body was still strong beneath his age, but a slight limp appeared whenever he stood. Most people never stopped long enough to notice him. They glanced at the information card attached to the gate and kept walking. 10 years old, retired K9, special handling recommended. Caleb watched 3 different families pass by in less than 2 minutes. None of them paused. The German Shepherd never reacted. He simply followed them with his eyes and then returned his gaze to the entrance door, as if waiting for someone specific. "What is his story?" Caleb asked. The shelter manager looked toward the kennel. "Rex." She sighed softly. "Been here almost 4 months." Caleb frowned. "For months." Longest resident in the building. The manager folded her arms. "People want young dogs. Easy dogs. First-time owner dogs." Her voice softened. "Not an old retired working dog with medical records thicker than a phone book." Caleb looked again. Rex still had not moved. "He looks healthy enough." "Healthy, yes. Young, no." The manager shook her head. "Every week somebody asks about him. Every week they choose another dog." A little girl approached the kennel with her parents. For a brief second, Caleb thought things might be different. The child smiled at Rex. Rex slowly stood. Not excited, not desperate, hopeful. The girl reached toward the gate. Then her father noticed the words retired K9 on the card. He gently guided her away. 30 seconds later, they were meeting a golden retriever puppy across the room. Rex remained standing for another moment, then quietly lowered himself back onto the blanket. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. The reaction lasted less than 3 seconds. The dog made no sound, yet somehow it felt heavier than barking ever could. "He does that every time," the manager said quietly. Caleb did not answer. He watched Rex instead. Most abandoned animals eventually learn to greet every stranger with excitement. Every person became another chance, another possibility. But this dog seemed different. He was not waiting for anyone. He was waiting for someone. The distinction lingered in Caleb's mind. An hour later, he finished repairing the heating unit. Warm air flowed through the vents again. Volunteers thanked him. Paperwork was signed. The job was done. Caleb gathered his tools and headed toward the exit. As he passed the final kennel, he felt eyes following him. He stopped. Rex had lifted his head. Nothing more. No barking. No movement. Just a calm, steady stare. Caleb glanced down at the information card attached to the gate. Most of it was ordinary. Age, breed, medical notes. But one detail caught his attention. Around the dog's neck rested an old leather collar, faded by years of use. The shelter tag hung beside it. Yet beneath the tag, partially hidden in the worn leather, something metallic reflected the overhead light. A second tag, older, nearly invisible. Caleb stared at it for a moment, then at the dog. Rex slowly lowered his head onto his paws, but never looked away. Outside, families continued leaving with newly adopted pets. Inside the final kennel, the old German Shepherd remained exactly where he was, waiting. And for reasons Caleb could not explain, he suddenly found himself wondering what was written on that forgotten piece of metal. The image of the old metal tag stayed with Caleb all evening, long after he left the shelter, long after he drove home through the fading Colorado sunset, long after he sat alone at the small kitchen table in his modest house on the edge of town. Outside, the wind moved through bare cottonwood trees. Inside, the television played quietly in the background. Caleb barely noticed it. Every few minutes, he found himself thinking about the German Shepherd in the last kennel. Not because the dog was old, not because he had been a K9. There were plenty of retired working dogs across the country. What bothered him was the way Rex watched the door. The dog did not behave like an animal waiting for adoption. He behaved like someone waiting for a promise to be fulfilled. The next morning, Caleb returned to the shelter under the excuse of checking the repaired heating system. Even he knew the excuse was weak. The shelter manager smiled the moment she saw him walk through the front door. Funny how often heating systems need checking around here. Caleb laughed softly, just making sure it still works. Of course you are. She pointed toward the back kennels. Your friend is where you left him. Rex was lying on the same blanket when Caleb arrived. The German Shepherd lifted his head immediately. Not excited, not desperate, simply aware. Caleb crouched beside the kennel gate. Up close, the signs of age became easier to see. Gray hairs around the muzzle, small scars hidden beneath the sable coat. Eyes that had seen more than most people ever would. Yet there was still dignity in the way he carried himself. You have had quite a life, haven't you? Caleb said quietly. Rex blinked once and rested his chin on his paws. The shelter manager joined him a few moments later. You know what is strange? She asked. Caleb glanced up. What? We tried removing that old collar when he arrived. She nodded toward Rex's neck. He would not let it go. Caleb looked back at the worn leather collar. Aggressive? Never. The manager shook her head. Just stubborn. A smile touched her face. The second we put it back on, he relaxed. Caleb studied the dog. The collar looked ancient. Cracked leather. Faded stitching. Years of wear. Most people would have thrown it away. Yet Rex guarded it like something precious. Nobody knows where he came from? Caleb asked. The paperwork is incomplete. The manager sighed. Transferred from another facility. Then another before that. She shrugged. Somewhere along the way, records disappeared. Caleb frowned. That happened more often than people realized. Shelters were overloaded. Staff changed. Files were misplaced. Stories got lost. Especially the stories of old dogs. A volunteer walked past with a young Labrador puppy. Several visitors immediately gathered around. Laughter filled the room. Phones appeared for photographs. Within minutes, adoption paperwork was already being discussed. Rex watched quietly from his kennel. Then he looked away. Not jealous, not disappointed, almost as if he expected it. Caleb felt his chest tighten again. How many times? He asked. How many times what? How many times has he been passed over? The manager hesitated. 23. Caleb stared at her. 23. She nodded. That is just the number we documented. Silence settled between them. 23 different families. 23 different chances. 23 moments when somebody chose another dog. Caleb looked back at Rex. The German Shepherd had closed his eyes. Yet one paw rested lightly against the old collar around his neck, protecting it even in sleep. And for the first time, Caleb found himself wondering if the secret to the dog's entire life was hanging from that forgotten strip of worn leather. 3 days later, Caleb stopped pretending he was only visiting the shelter to check equipment. Even the volunteers had started greeting him with knowing smiles. The truth was simple. He came to see Rex. Every afternoon after work, he found himself parking outside the same building. Every afternoon, he walked directly toward the final kennel. And every afternoon, the old German Shepherd quietly lifted his head the moment Caleb appeared. There was something strangely comforting about the routine. No demands, no expectations, just recognition. On Thursday evening, the shelter had grown unusually quiet. Most visitors were gone. Volunteers were finishing their shifts. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Caleb sat on a folding chair beside Rex's kennel while the dog rested near the gate. For several minutes, neither moved. The silence felt natural. Eventually, Caleb reached through the bars and gently scratched behind Rex's ear. The German Shepherd closed his eyes. Not because he was sleepy, because he trusted the touch. You know, Caleb said softly, You are making it very hard to stay objective. One ear twitched. That was the only response. Yet somehow it felt like a conversation. The shelter manager appeared carrying cleaning supplies. She paused when she saw them together. You are the first person he has done that with. Caleb looked up. Done what? Relaxed. She nodded toward the dog. Usually he stays alert all day. Caleb glanced back at Rex. The shepherd's breathing was slow and steady. Peaceful. Maybe he is just tired. The manager smiled sadly. No, he is waiting. The answer lingered in the air long after she walked away. Waiting. Caleb had been thinking the same thing for days. Later, after the shelter closed, the manager unlocked the kennel so staff could clean it properly. Rex stepped out and stretched carefully. His slight limp was more noticeable now. Age had begun winning small battles against a body built for work. Even so, he carried himself with quiet dignity. Caleb crouched nearby. For the first time, he could closely examine the old collar. The leather was worn smooth from years of use. Tiny cracks covered its surface. The shelter identification tag hung beside another piece of metal almost completely hidden underneath. Caleb gently touched the collar. Rex immediately looked at him. Not defensive. Curious. Easy, buddy. The shepherd remained still. Caleb carefully turned the collar just enough to see the second tag more clearly. Dust and age covered most of its surface. Whatever had once been engraved there had nearly disappeared. Has anyone ever cleaned this? Caleb asked. The shelter manager shook her head. We tried. Rex became anxious whenever we removed it. Caleb studied the tag again. Faint markings seemed buried beneath years of wear. Not readable. Not yet, but definitely there. Something important enough for a retired working dog to protect for years. The next afternoon, Caleb returned carrying a small cloth and a bottle of leather conditioner. He asked permission first. The shelter manager agreed. Rex watched carefully as Caleb sat beside him inside a quiet visitation room. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Dust floated in the warm beams of light. For several moments, Caleb simply held the collar between his hands. The leather felt old, real, lived in. Then he began cleaning it gently. Slow movements. No force. No rousing. Rex never looked away. Minute after minute passed. Dirt lifted from the surface. The metal beneath slowly emerged. Scratches became visible. Then letters. Very faint at first. Almost invisible. Caleb leaned closer. His heartbeat quickened. One line of engraving began appearing through the years of wear. The words were still incomplete, broken by age and corrosion. But there was enough to know one thing with certainty. This was not an ordinary dog tag, and whatever message had been hidden on it all these years was about to change everything. Caleb held the metal tag beneath the visitation room light, while rain drifted softly against the windows outside. The shelter had closed an hour earlier. Volunteers were gone. The building felt quieter than usual. Only the low hum of ventilation and the occasional bark from a distant kennel broke the silence. Rex sat beside him, watching every movement. Not nervous, not protective, almost expectant. Caleb carefully rubbed away another layer of dirt and corrosion. More letters emerged from the worn surface. His eyes narrowed as he slowly pieced together the message. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he read it again to make sure he had not imagined it. K9 Rex, partner of staff Sergeant Noah Bennett. If found, bring him home. Caleb felt a chill move through him. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Across from him, Rex remained perfectly still. The old German shepherd seemed to recognize the moment, as though he'd been waiting years for someone to finally read those words. Noah Bennett, Caleb whispered. The name meant nothing to him. At least not yet. The shelter manager stepped closer. What does it say? Caleb handed her the tag. Her expression changed as she read the inscription. Oh my God! Neither spoke for several moments. The rain continued tapping softly against the glass. Finally, the manager sat down beside him. Nobody ever mentioned this in the records. Caleb nodded. Maybe nobody ever saw it. The metal tag had been hidden beneath the shelter identification tag for years. Time had nearly erased the engraving completely. Another year or two, and the message might have disappeared forever. Caleb looked toward Rex. "You kept this collar all this time." The dog slowly wagged his tail once against the floor. A small movement, barely noticeable, yet somehow it felt important. The next morning, Caleb arrived before work and asked permission to review every available document connected to Rex. The shelter manager gathered old files from storage cabinets and transfer records from previous facilities. The paperwork was incomplete. Several gaps existed. Entire sections were missing, but a few details emerged. Rex had once belonged to a military working dog program. Years later, he had been transferred after retirement, then transferred again. Somewhere along the way, contact information had been lost. Eventually, the dog entered the shelter system carrying little more than his aging collar. Caleb spent hours searching public records online. Staff Sergeant Noah Bennett. The name appeared in scattered military community articles and veterans organization newsletters. Each mention painted a similar picture. Dedicated, respected, quiet. One article included a photograph taken years earlier. Caleb stopped scrolling. In the picture, a younger German shepherd stood beside a smiling soldier. Even through the passage of time, there was no mistaking the dog. The same alert eyes, the same ears, the same small notch visible along one edge. Rex. Caleb leaned back in his chair. Suddenly, the old shepherd's behavior began making sense. The waiting, the collar, the refusal to let go of the past. This was not simply an old dog holding onto a piece of leather. This was loyalty stretched across years, across distance, across loss. Later that evening, Caleb returned to the shelter carrying a printed copy of the photograph. He entered the visitation room and sat beside Rex. The dog immediately noticed the paper in his hand. Caleb placed it gently on the floor between them. For a long moment, Rex stared at the image. Then something changed in his eyes. Not excitement, not confusion, recognition. The shepherd carefully lowered his nose to the photograph and touched it once. Very gently. Caleb swallowed hard. Outside, the rain clouds were finally beginning to clear. Inside, for the first time, Caleb understood that he was no longer helping a shelter dog. He was helping someone find his way home. The photograph stayed on Caleb's kitchen table for the next several days. Every morning before work, he glanced at it while drinking coffee. Every evening, he returned to it. A younger Noah Bennett stood smiling beneath a bright summer sky, one hand resting on Rex's shoulder. The bond between them was obvious even in a picture taken years ago. Caleb had seen similar expressions before. Marines and their partners. Veterans and the dogs who served beside them. Trust that could not be explained to people who had never experienced it. Yet one question refused to leave his mind. If Noah had cared this much about Rex, why had the dog ended up alone? The answer began arriving in pieces. Caleb contacted a veterans organization whose newsletter had mentioned Noah years earlier. Most records were limited, but one retired service member remembered him. The man spoke kindly. Noah had returned home after military service. He had struggled with health issues later in life. Through everything, Rex remained by his side. That dog went everywhere with him, the veteran said over the phone. You never saw one without the other. Caleb thanked him and stared out the window for a long time after the call ended. Outside, snow was slowly melting from the edges of sidewalks. Spring was beginning to push winter away. At the shelter, Rex continued waiting. Yet something subtle had changed. The old shepherd no longer watched the entrance door every second of the day. Sometimes he watched Caleb instead. Volunteers noticed it too. He listens for your truck, one of them said with a smile. Caleb laughed, but he knew she was right. Each afternoon, before he even reached the kennel area, Rex would already be standing, tail moving slowly, eyes fixed on the hallway. Not excitement, recognition. One evening, Caleb arrived carrying a small bag of dog treats. Rex accepted them politely before settling beside him on the floor of the visitation room. The old shepherd leaned slightly against his leg. It was the first physical contact Rex had initiated. Caleb felt an unexpected lump form in his throat. You are starting to trust me, aren't you? He whispered. Rex closed his eyes. A few days later, another breakthrough came. After hours of searching public records, Caleb located an old address connected to Noah Bennett. The house was no longer listed under his name. Property records showed ownership had changed years ago. Still, the location gave Caleb something he had not possessed before. A place, a direction, a thread worth following. He printed the information and carried it to the shelter the next day. Sitting beside Rex, he unfolded the paper. I think I found where he lived. The German shepherd immediately lifted his head. Caleb smiled at himself. Rationally, he knew the dog could not understand every word. Yet Rex reacted every time Noah's name appeared. Every single time. The shelter manager entered carrying paperwork. "You know," she said quietly, "there is something else." Caleb looked up. "What?" She handed him a thin transfer document discovered in storage. It was old and partially damaged. Several lines were unreadable, but one section remained clear. Emergency contact. Beneath it appeared a name. Not Noah Bennett. A woman. Caleb stared at the page. His pulse quickened. If the information was still valid, then somewhere beyond the missing records and lost years, there might be someone who once knew Rex. Someone who might still remember him. Across the room, the old German shepherd slowly rose to his feet and walked toward the paper. He lowered his nose to the name, then looked directly at Caleb. For the first time since this journey began, the path forward no longer felt impossible. The name on the transfer document was Emily Bennett. Caleb spent the rest of the evening searching public records from his kitchen table, while Rex's photograph sat beside his laptop. Outside, spring rain tapped gently against the windows. Midnight came and went before he finally found something useful. A current address. Not far away. Less than 90 miles from town. The next afternoon, after finishing work, Caleb returned to the shelter carrying a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket. Rex was waiting at the kennel gate. The old German shepherd stood before Caleb even reached him. His amber eyes seemed brighter than usual. Caleb knelt beside him. "I think we found someone, buddy." Rex tilted his head slightly. The familiar reaction sent a chill through Caleb. He still could not explain why the dog seemed to recognize certain names and moments. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was something deeper. Either way, the connection felt real. The shelter manager agreed to accompany Caleb the following Saturday. Neither wanted to create false hope. Records could be outdated. People moved. Families changed. Still, the possibility was too important to ignore. Saturday arrived beneath clear blue skies. Snow had almost completely disappeared from the foothills. Caleb drove, while the shelter manager sat beside him reviewing copies of old documents. Nearly 90 minutes later, they turned onto a quiet residential street lined with maple trees. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks. Wind chimes swayed from front porches. It looked like the kind of neighborhood where people stayed for years. Caleb parked across from a modest white house with a small flower garden near the entrance. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The moment suddenly felt heavier than either expected. "Ready?" the shelter manager asked softly. Caleb nodded. They walked to the front door and rang the bell. Footsteps approached from inside. A woman in her early 30s opened the door. She wore gardening gloves and looked mildly surprised to find strangers standing outside. Caleb introduced himself and carefully explained why they had come. At first she seemed confused. Then he mentioned Noah Bennett. Everything changed. The color drained slightly from her face. "Noah was my father," she said quietly. For a moment, nobody moved. The world seemed to narrow around that single sentence. Caleb slowly removed the photograph from a folder he carried. The woman looked down. Her hand immediately covered her mouth. Tears appeared before she spoke another word. "Rex." The name escaped as barely more than a whisper. She took the photograph with trembling fingers. "That is Rex." Caleb felt his heartbeat quicken. "You remember him?" A small laugh broke through her tears. "Remember him?" She looked toward the house behind her. "Come inside." The living room felt warm and lived in. Family photographs covered the walls. Books lined shelves. Sunlight poured through wide windows. Then Caleb saw it. On a shelf near the fireplace sat a framed picture of a younger girl sitting beside a German shepherd. The same German shepherd. The same notch in the ear. The same intelligent eyes. Emily followed his gaze and smiled through tears. I was 12 when that picture was taken. She gently touched the frame. After my father passed away, we were told Rex had been transferred. Then everything became unclear. Her voice trembled. Eventually, we stopped hearing anything. Caleb sat quietly, listening. Across the room, surrounded by memories and photographs, one realization settled heavily into his heart. Rex had not spent years waiting for a place. He had spent years waiting for people who never stopped loving him. Caleb returned to the shelter that evening carrying more than documents and photographs. He carried certainty. For months, maybe years, everyone had looked at Rex and seen an aging shelter dog. Now, the picture was finally becoming clear. The old shepherd had never forgotten where he belonged. The following morning, Caleb arrived earlier than usual. Rex was already standing at the kennel gate. His tail moved slowly when he saw him. Caleb crouched beside the fence and smiled. "I found them, buddy." The German shepherd stepped forward until his nose touched Caleb's hand. The simple gesture felt different now, as though some invisible distance between them had disappeared. Later that afternoon, Emily arrived at the shelter. She had barely slept the night before. The shelter manager met her at the entrance while volunteers quietly stepped aside. Word had spread throughout the building. Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. Emily carried an old photo album pressed tightly against her chest. Her hands trembled as she walked down the kennel corridor. The final kennel stood exactly where it always had. The same blanket, the same water bowl, the same aging shepherd. For a moment, neither moved. Time seemed to stop. Then Rex slowly stood. His ears lifted. His amber eyes widened. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "Rex," she whispered. The shepherd froze. Not from fear. Recognition. Deep, unmistakable recognition. Emily knelt on the concrete floor outside the kennel. The photo album slipped from her hands. Pictures spilled across the ground. Birthday parties. Family picnics. Summer afternoons. In photograph after photograph, a younger Rex appeared beside Noah and a smiling little girl. The dog stared at the images, then at Emily, then back to the images. The shelter manager quietly opened the kennel door. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed the moment. Rex stepped forward carefully. Age had slowed him, but not enough to hide his determination. Emily remained kneeling. Tears streamed down her face. "It is okay," she whispered. "I am here." The old shepherd crossed the final few feet and gently pressed his head against her shoulder. A sound escaped from Emily that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. She wrapped her arms around his neck. For several seconds, the entire shelter seemed silent. Volunteers wiped their eyes. Even the shelter manager turned away for a moment. Caleb stood near the wall, watching quietly. He knew this reunion could never erase the lost years. It could never return the time that had slipped away. But some wounds did not need to disappear completely in order to heal. Emily sat with Rex for nearly 2 hours. She told stories. She showed photographs. She spoke Noah's name aloud. Each time she did, Rex listened with complete attention, as though every memory still lived inside him. Eventually, Emily opened the final page of the photo album. Tucked inside was an old picture Caleb had never seen before. Noah sat on a front porch holding a coffee mug while Rex rested beside him. On the back, written in faded ink, were a few simple words. "Home is wherever we are together." Emily stared at the sentence for a long moment. Then she looked at Caleb. "My father wrote that." Caleb nodded quietly. Across the room, Rex lowered himself onto the floor beside her chair. For the first time since Caleb had known him, the old shepherd closed his eyes without watching the door. He no longer looked toward the entrance. He no longer seemed to be waiting, because after all these years, someone had finally found him before it was too late. The following week brought changes nobody at the shelter had expected. For the first time since arriving there, Rex no longer seemed like a forgotten resident waiting for his number to be called. Emily visited every afternoon after work. Sometimes she brought old photographs. Sometimes she brought stories. Sometimes she simply sat beside him in the visitation room while sunlight drifted through the windows. Caleb often joined them. Together, they slowly pieced back together a history that had nearly vanished. One afternoon, Emily arrived carrying a weathered storage box she had found in her attic. Dust covered the lid. The cardboard corners were worn with age. She placed it carefully on the table while Caleb and the shelter manager watched. Inside were memories nobody expected to find. Old veterinary records, training certificates, letters Noah had saved over the years. Beneath them all rested a faded red leash. The moment Rex saw it, he stood up. His ears lifted. His tail moved slowly. Emily froze. "I cannot believe this," she whispered. Caleb looked down at the leash. The leather handle was cracked from use. A brass nameplate remained attached near the clasp. Noah and Rex. Emily swallowed hard. "My father used this every day." She carefully offered the leash to the shepherd. Rex lowered his nose and inhaled deeply. Then he closed his eyes. The room became very quiet. Some scents never truly disappear. Some memories live beyond words. Later that day, the shelter organized a small gathering for volunteers who had cared for Rex during his months there. Nothing formal, just coffee, cookies, and gratitude. Several volunteers shared stories. One remembered how Rex always waited near the entrance each morning. Another recalled how he gently comforted frightened rescue animals during storms. The shelter manager smiled through tears as she listened. "We thought we were helping him," she said softly. "Maybe he was helping us." The room filled with quiet laughter. Even Caleb smiled. As the days passed, Emily faced a difficult decision. Everyone assumed Rex would immediately move into her home. Emotionally, it made sense. She loved him. He remembered her. Yet reality was more complicated. Emily traveled frequently for work. Her townhouse had limited space. She wanted what was best for Rex, not what simply felt right in the moment. One evening, she sat on a bench outside the shelter with Caleb, while Rex rested between them. The sun was setting behind distant mountains, painting the sky gold and amber. "I've been thinking about something," Emily said. Caleb nodded. "Me too." She looked down at the shepherd. "He lights up every time you walk through that door." Caleb remained silent. Emily smiled gently. "And he trusts you." For a long moment, neither spoke. Wind moved softly through nearby trees. Rex rested his head on Caleb's boot. It was such a simple gesture that most people would have missed it, but Emily saw it immediately. So did Caleb. Months earlier, 23 families had passed this dog by. 23 chances had come and gone. Yet somehow the person who finally stopped walking had never been looking for a dog at all. As the last sunlight faded beyond the horizon, all three sat together in comfortable silence, each beginning to understand that the journey was leading toward an answer none of them had expected when it first began. 2 weeks later, the final adoption papers rested on a wooden desk inside the shelter office. Morning sunlight poured through the windows, warming the room with the gentle promise of spring. Volunteers moved quietly through the hallway. Some smiled. Some wiped away tears they tried to hide. The shelter manager looked down at the signed documents and shook her head with a laugh. "After everything, I should have seen this coming." Caleb smiled. Across the room, Rex lay peacefully on a blanket, one paw resting over the old collar that had started everything. Not because he was protecting it anymore, because it simply belonged there, like an old photograph in a family home, like a memory that no longer needed defending. Emily stood beside Caleb, holding a folder filled with copies of Noah's photographs and records. Over the past days, she and Caleb had talked often about Rex, about Noah, about responsibility, about what truly mattered. In the end, the answer had become clear to both of them. Love was not ownership. Love was doing what was best for someone, even when another choice might feel easier. Emily knelt beside Rex and gently scratched behind his ear. The shepherd immediately leaned into her hand. "You know," she whispered, smiling through moist eyes, "my father would have liked him ending up with a Marine." Caleb laughed softly. "You think so?" "Absolutely." She looked at the old dog. "And I think Rex already made his choice." Almost on cue, the shepherd slowly stood and walked across the room until he reached Caleb. Then he sat beside him, close enough that his shoulder touched Caleb's leg. The shelter manager laughed. "Well, there is your answer." Even Caleb could not argue with that. The adoption was finalized before noon. Volunteers gathered near the entrance to say goodbye. One by one, they knelt to hug the old shepherd. Rex accepted every gesture with calm dignity. He seemed to understand that these people had cared for him during a difficult chapter of his life. There was gratitude in the way he looked at them. Gratitude and peace. When it was finally time to leave, Caleb clipped the faded red leash onto the old collar. The same leash Noah had once used. The same collar Rex had protected for years. Together, they stepped through the shelter doors into bright sunlight. Nobody hurried. Nobody spoke much. Some moments were too important for words. That evening, Emily joined them at Caleb's house on the edge of town. The three of them sat on the back porch, overlooking rolling Colorado foothills painted gold by the setting sun. Birds drifted across the sky. Wind moved softly through the trees. A pot of coffee sat between two chairs. The world felt slower there. Simpler. Better. Emily opened the old photo album one final time. She paused on the picture of Noah sitting beside a younger Rex on a porch many years ago. For a while, nobody said anything. Then she smiled and closed the album. He would be happy. Caleb nodded. He believed that too. At their feet, Rex slept deeply. Not the cautious sleep Caleb had seen in the shelter. Not the restless sleep of a dog waiting for someone to come back. This was different. His breathing was slow, peaceful, certain. The old shepherd no longer watched doors. He no longer listened for footsteps. The waiting was over. As the last light of day settled across the hills, Caleb looked down at the dog beside him and realized something. 23 families had walked past that final kennel. 23 opportunities had come and gone. Yet the story had never been about who wanted Rex. It had been about who was willing to stop long enough to see him. The sun disappeared beyond the horizon. Golden light faded into evening blue. On the porch of a quiet home, beneath a sky full of stars beginning to appear, a retired K-9 slept with his head resting against the boot of a Marine. The old collar remained around his neck. The promise engraved upon it had finally been kept. And for the first time in many years, Rex was exactly where he belonged.